afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege for me to welcome you here in the Bohemian National Hall on this occasion. My name is Jan Švejnar. I am professor at Columbia University and also was there in Prague at the start of CERGE-EI, which we're celebrating today, its 30th anniversary. I'll just say a few words about the origins. They were actually quite interesting. I ran into a Czech economist in 1989 named Josef Zieleniec, and we were at a conference in Vienna. He came with $10. That's all he got as an allocation. So I bought him a beer and we started talking. And we said, well, you know, there will be some need for Western educated economists in this entire Soviet bloc region because economics, in the sense that we know it, was not taught there at the time. And so this idea was there, and then fall of the Berlin Wall, and we started. So we marched into the office of the new rector of Charles University, Vadim Paloš, who was a famous philosopher, dissident, worked with Václav Havel. Now he was a new rector, and we said, you know, we're going to start for you a top-notch economics department here. We're going to bring in students from all over, you know, former Soviet bloc, and Charles University is again going to be famous in this. And he says, economics, is that a science? And I said, well, you know, we have theories, we test hypotheses. And he says, okay, that sounds good. You know, I've just abolished the Institute of Marxism and Leninism, so you can take over. So we did. And temporarily, we even had a car with a chauffeur because the Institute of Marxism and Leninism was not shabby in those days. So this was the beginning. Then we lost the chauffeur in the car. That was not quite what we could keep. But it started. And indeed, the first cohort, Michala Erbenová is here, and some others, were students who really were courageous because they were no upperclassmen, right? So we were recruiting them to, you know, come, we'll give you this excellent American-style education, and by the way, you'll do great things. And they were kind of looking at us saying, well, I'm not quite sure that that's really, you know, what it is, but they went for it, and the end is history. So by today, CERGE-EI has had over 900 alumni. About more than 40% are women. They come from all over the former Soviet bloc, the Balkan part of the world. Nowadays they apply and come from actually all over the world, but the focus is still there. We have top-notch faculty who actually live by the highest world standards, and that's thanks to the Executive and Supervisory Committee, which is composed of renowned economists. A number of them are sitting here amongst us, who really have set and maintained the standard at the top level. And so CERGE-EI is now recognized as a center of excellence generally. It's focusing on the region, but generally. Recent assessment, two assessments, international assessments, 5-year assessment of Charles University and separate assessment of the Academy of Sciences of the Czech Republic. CERGE-EI belongs to these two institutions. CERGE, the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education, is at Charles University, and EI, the Economics Institute at the Academy. So there were these two evaluations, and CERGE-EI, and each of them came as number 1. So nobody else. So 51 institutes of the Academy of Sciences across all sciences, and similarly at Charles University. So it's a real tribute to the Executive and Supervisory Committee, the faculty who are publishing in top journals and therefore the ranking, and the excellent students who come to work there. And actually the vision we had that the students would go into the academe, teach, some would go into the public sector and some into the private sector has actually transpired. It's really been like that. And the impact has been incredible. We actually did some calculations looking at where the faculty have taught both at CERGE-EI, but also outreach programs, where the students, the alumni started teaching their students and so on and so forth. And actually, without doing all this multiplier effect, there's over 500,000 students in the region who've been taught as a result of the core activity at CERGE-EI and the outreach that has grown. So it's been a real pleasure, and if you come to Prague, definitely do come and visit in Politických vězňů. It's actually a palatial building, which is partially a coincidence because the Academy had a palatial building, and as I always kept saying, you know, starting CERGE-EI was important, but capturing the building was equally important. So on that note, let me invite the Consul General of the Czech Republic to give us a few words of introduction. Arnošt.
Distinguished Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Czech friends, compatriots, ladies and gentlemen. I believe I'm going to be the serious one, you know. After Honza, you know, it's hard to take the stage and then say something funny, something really attractive. So I'll be more or less, you know, on the governmental side, and I'll try to share my point of view as the foreign mission Czech diplomat and working closely with CERGE-EI. Definitely, it's both a privilege and honor to share the stage with the world-leading capacities, and the pleasure to be surrounded by people dedicated to excellence in economics. Being an economist myself, I'm a bit ashamed, insecure to be here with Nobel Memorial Prize laureates. However, really, let me sincerely welcome you to Bohemian National Hall, which is the home of the Czech Consulate General. Today, we are commemorating 30 years since the founding of joint workplace of Charles University and Czech Academy of Sciences, CERGE-EI, Center of Economic Research and Graduate Education. CERGE-EI emerged 30 years ago in order to accelerate the development and research in the area of economics, in post-transition and transition economics. And now I'm gonna try to a bit, you know, not to be on the same rail, you know, same tracks, you know, as my duty to be a diplomat. And let me comment, let me modify a bit the topic of today's event and play with that a bit. And with the permission of such world capacities in economics, allow me to remark where we are right now, almost 33 years after the Velvet Revolution, the fall of so-called Prague Wall, not Berlin Wall, Prague Wall, the communist regime. As you know, last year we had general elections back home. And I'm not supposed to comment on it, however, let me do an exception. We really have a unique situation this coming November, 33 years after the Velvet Revolution, as we will celebrate November 17 without the Communist Party and the Chamber of Deputies of the Parliament of the Czech Republic. I have to say, such a long time it took us. But, so what is the future? I strongly believe the following panel discussion of the top capacities will bring the answer to challenging issues in economics, energy security, other issues. Especially energy security, it's really alive, you know, mirror. Probably you saw the headlines, breaking news, you know, that Poland was cut off from the Russian gas today, as of today, tomorrow. However, I have to stress out that on February 24, 2022, we woke up in a totally different world. Russian aggression in Ukraine and its impact on surrounding region have proved that the fall of Berlin Wall and the Cold War, whose ending was celebrated more than 30 years ago, have revived, and it's still heating up again. These days, more than ever, initiatives to raise the standards of economics education, leadership, good and effective governance, this is most important, critical play, is in supporting national and regional stability. It's my understanding that CERGE-EI is exactly the institution providing such an approach. I would like to thank CERGE-EI for the job done related to young generation of economists. CERGE-EI's master and PhD programs rank among the most prestigious. CERGE-EI has brought incredible young men and women who continue to fill out the top jobs of the Central European region and throughout the world. And personally, I'm so happy that even Czech diplomacy really appreciates graduates from CERGE-EI and try to attract them to join our foreign service. Dear Professor Švejnar, drahý Honzo, please take care of today's young but mature enough and successful 30 years old institution for at least another 30 years. Yeah, you can, that's good. I wish CERGE-EI to further increase and accelerate its position in higher learning and in economics research and education in international context. To conclude my speech, please let me express my thanks to all those who have contributed to this special event, and all of you who came tonight to celebrate 30th anniversary of CERGE-EI. We at the Czech Consulate are so proud to be partner of today's event. Thank you. Enjoy it.
I wanted to continue the initial speech just a little bit longer because there is one particular institution which I think is very important, and that's the CERGE-EI Foundation, which works seamlessly with CERGE-EI from virtually the beginning. We started the foundation in 1993. That foundation has been really fundamentally instrumental in us being to deliver the quality of the programs that we have. And it's wonderful to work out Dalos here as the chairman of the board, and Tony Claudino, with whom most of you interacted as the new president, to be able to continue. And indeed, the foundation has focused on CERGE-EI, but we are currently also doing a fundraising drive for Ukraine, in particular for students at CERGE-EI who are caught in the midst of the conflict back home. And so I want to thank the foundation both for everything it has done in terms of CERGE-EI and more broadly here. And let me end by personal thanks to somebody without whom all this would not have happened, and that's Professor Orly Ashenfelter sitting here. Professor Ashenfelter, who is one of the foremost economists, should have received the Nobel Prize this last fall, but they missed it, so I feel very bad about it. But he is the one who decided to give me the PhD degree. Had he not done that, I would have probably not been able to be in Prague at that time and start CERGE-EI. So really, he's all responsible for everything. I think it's time to come to the first part of the program. We will have two speakers who are coming from far away, Francis Fukuyama and Jeffrey Sachs, and then we'll have our 5 panelists right here afterwards. So organizers tell me what we should do. You're going to bring them here. There it is. Frank and Jeff, can you hear me? There you are.
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, here are two people who need no introduction. But indeed, I think we couldn't have wished to start the program with anybody else but these two renowned economists, political scientists. Both of them work in the cross-section and cross-fertilize both fields. Jeff and I actually go back all the way to graduate school when we used to go skiing together, hoping to become economists. And, you know, it actually did happen. So it's wonderful. And we're colleagues at Columbia. Jeff is a university professor at Columbia, author of numerous articles, books, best-selling author, leader, influencer in terms of policies. So it's wonderful to have you here, Jeff. And Frank and I go back even further. We were actually classmates and housemates at Columbia. We both lived in Telluride House, which is an organization which brings together young people and gives them a self-governance. This is a self-governing community, intellectually oriented. So Frank and I talked about many lofty issues, including who should clean the bathroom that connected our 2 rooms. And indeed, it was a pleasure to have Frank as a classmate and follow his career. As many of you know, he is one of the most influential political writers. His End of History and subsequent works have made him be known all around the world. So what we'll have is each one of them will speak. Maybe we'll start with you, Frank, for 15 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to have questions and answers. So let's start. Frank, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Unfortunately, we haven't seen each other physically since we were undergraduates, but I imagine neither of us has aged very much since then. So I want to talk about the political changes that have happened in the years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which have been pretty momentous. In 1989 or in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, we were in the middle of what the great political scientist Samuel Huntington labeled the third wave of democratization. This wave started with the transitions of Spain and Portugal in the early 1990s. The world went from having approximately 35 liberal democracies in the early 1970s to having about 120, depending on how you define a liberal democracy, by the early 2000s. And so 1989 was really at the midpoint, and certainly one of the most dramatic moments when the number of countries that were either democracies or aspiring to be democracies expanded very broadly. And this expansion continued in Asia, continued in sub-Saharan Africa, many other parts of the world. Now, over the last 16 years, we've been in what my colleague Larry Diamond calls a democratic recession. Freedom House, in its annual Freedom in the World survey, has noted a decline in aggregate global democracy for 16 years straight, and the drop last year was particularly severe and included the two largest democracies in the world, the United States and India. And I think with the onset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing the non-democratic world colliding very dramatically in ways that are going to have big consequences. If we ask ourselves why this change happened, it's something I've written extensively about over the last 15 years, but I think there are a number of causes. Some of it has been traced to globalization, the kinds of economic inequalities that have been created. Some of them have to do with migration because there's been an extraordinary increase in the number of people crossing international borders. In Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, that's taken a particular form that has been politically very relevant because many Eastern European countries have actually become depopulated, meaning they've lost 20-30% of their population as people sought greater opportunities in Western Europe. And so if you're living in Belgrade or Sarajevo these days, it's very hard to get a doctor or a nurse because they've all left to work in Berlin or London or some other Western European city. And this has had also a big impact in Western Europe as well, where it's triggered a populist backlash movement against immigration. People think that this is due to immigration from the Middle East, but a lot of it actually is immigrants from Eastern Europe, who by far are the largest immigrant group in Western Europe. I think another factor has to do with generational turnover. People like to live in liberal societies when they've experienced dictatorship or conflict directly, but you've now got an entire generation of people living in Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union that have no direct living experience of what it means to be under a dictatorship. And I think under those conditions, you can take the peace and security of a liberal democracy for granted. And then finally, there's an important cultural element. I think as we've seen with the rise of populist regimes in Hungary and Poland, the liberalization of cultural attitudes in many parts of the former communist world was actually quite superficial. There was an elite that led the Velvet Revolution and other revolutions in the region that really wanted sincerely to join Western Europe. But under communism, the region had never engaged in an attempt to shift the cultural attitudes of people. It denied, the idea of national identity, and it really never taught people to accept more liberal values. And you can see that in the contrast with Germany, where the Germans spent a couple of generations trying to teach their young people about the Holocaust, about the horrors of Nazism in ways that really led to a very different kind of civic culture in that country, where not only did you eliminate German militarism, you can't get the Germans to do anything of a military nature, even when it's really called for to defend democracy when it's threatened. And so the liberalization was extremely, I think, superficial in Eastern Europe. If we move to the present and the crisis that's now unfolding in Ukraine, and you say, what's the most important change that has occurred in that period? I would actually say it is a change in what the Soviets used to call the correlation of forces. That is to say, in the actual military balance and the political weight of let's say, the NATO alliance as opposed to Russia and its relatively few friends, where there's been a big investment in the Russian military, but more importantly, you've seen the rise of populist movements in many democratic countries that are attacking the established liberal institutions in each of their countries. This attack was probably nowhere more prominent than in the United States with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Trump expressed hostility to NATO. He consistently, from even before he was elected president, showed sympathy for Vladimir Putin. And, he did an incredible amount to increase the level of polarization that had already reached extremely high levels by the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, and he exacerbated them even further. And I think that this is part of the narrative that both the Russians and the Chinese began to tell about the decline of the West, and particularly about the decline of the United States. And it was matched by a pullback in American foreign policy. We had overextended ourselves in Afghanistan and Iraq. We pulled out of Afghanistan in a very messy way. And there was a general mood in the United States not to take its international obligations nearly as seriously. Now, I think it's important to understand the political moment and what the Russian invasion of Ukraine signifies, because if you ask what's changed in the past 30 years, there's one thing that hasn't changed very much, and that is actually Russian elite attitudes towards a whole sequence of events that unfolded beginning with the fall of the Berlin Wall. That elite was never reconciled to those events, and they were particularly not reconciled to the collapse of the Soviet Union after the Ukrainian referendum in December 1991, following the failed conservative coup attempt in August of that year. There was a lot of discussion before the onset of the invasion that suggested that Russian action was driven by NATO expansion. I have no doubt that the Russians did not like NATO expansion, but I think in the end this was not the reason that they invaded Ukraine. And I think the reason that I can say that is just by listening very carefully to what Vladimir Putin has said. I mean, he famously noted that the collapse of the former Soviet Union was one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. He wrote a long article last summer in which he basically argued that Ukraine is not a nation, that it was an artificial creation, that it was actually tragically ripped from out of the former Soviet Union, manipulated either by Lenin himself or by foreign forces, and that there was a historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people. He repeated this argument when he gave a speech a couple of days before the onset of the declaration of the independence of these two republics, so-called republics in the Donbass. And, from that, it seems to me pretty clear that NATO expansion was just an excuse. The real issue for for Russia and for Putin and his narrow circle of friends was actually what happened in the period from 1989 to 1991. That group had never reconciled itself to the collapse of communism and to the collapse of the former Soviet Union. It's very interesting, in Russian-occupied Kherson, this port on the Sea of Azov that the Russians have managed to occupy, they are now flying Russian and Soviet flags over the city hall. And so there is a clear continuity between the kind of imperial understanding of Russian national identity that existed not just in Soviet times, but in the 19th century under the influence of ideas of pan-Slavism and Russophilism, and that identity is one that cannot tolerate the existence of smaller countries around Russia's border that Russia does not control. And I think that is why the current war is so consequential for global politics. This is not a local dispute between Ukraine and Russia. This is a dispute between two different conceptions of political order. I spent a lot of time in Ukraine over the last 8 years. We run a number of training programs, my center at Stanford, for young Ukrainians. And I'm perfectly aware of all of the defects of Ukrainian democracy, the high levels of corruption, its domination by oligarchs and the like. But to me, there's no question that Ukraine is a free society in a very, very deep sense, in a way that Russia simply is not. And I think that the unbelievable tenacity of the Ukrainians fighting the Russians in this war so far reflects the fact that Ukrainian national identity is something important and is something that is very much treasured by a very, very large part of the Ukrainian population, including those Russian speakers who, by the way, are now the biggest victims of Russian aggression, living in places like Mariupol or Kharkiv, and that the objective of the Russians is not their security. It was never in question. The objective for them had always been to reverse the last 30 years of history, to undermine the Europe whole and free that we thought we had created at the conclusion of the Cold War. The demands that the Russians were making in the negotiations leading up to the invasion included essentially the neutralization of the Czech Republic, of Poland, of the Baltic states, of all, not just the countries that lately joined NATO, but the original group that was in the original expansion. And that means that this really does make Ukraine kind of the front line of a global fight against authoritarian government and democracy. I'll just conclude by saying I'm relatively optimistic about what's going to happen right now. A lot of pundits are saying that we're headed towards a prolonged stalemate as the war moves to a new phase in the Donbass. I don't actually think that's going to happen. I think that there is a decent chance that the Ukrainians will defeat the Russians outright. I can explain at much greater length why I believe that, but the motivation of the Ukrainians is much, much higher than the Russians. 250,000 Ukrainians have returned to Ukraine in order to fight for their country. Russians are leaving Russia because they don't want to fight for the Putin regime. And so I think that this difference in morale, and with the help of the NATO allies, is going to give Ukraine very deep advantages. And that will have important impacts that will reach back into many democratic countries. And it will reflect badly on politicians like Donald Trump that claim to admire Putin as a genius. He doesn't look like very much of a genius right now. He looks like a leader that's made one of the biggest historical mistakes in living memory. So with that, let me conclude. It's been a rough and very tumultuous 30 years, but I do think there's some hope that at the end of that period, we may return to a little bit of the spirit that animated, the Velvet Revolution and the events that took place in 1989. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me now bring Jeff in, and just to add to what I already said, Jeff has in a very important way influenced CERGE-EI, has been there at the founding time, has come many times since then, has indeed talked to students, faculty, and also in terms of what's happened over the last 30 years, contributed in a very important way from the very beginning to the discussion of how transformation could be done and, in fact, how it would be then implemented. So it's wonderful to have you actually put your perspective both on the current events but also the 30 years. Thank you, Jeff.
Great. Jan, thank you very, very much, and happy birthday to CERGE-EI. And indeed, I do remember the founding and the excitement and all of the fulfillment of your objectives and dreams. It's so impressive, and really a warm congratulations to everybody that has been part of this remarkable development. I do remember very vividly from 35 years ago onward, watching these decisive events in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. I have a different understanding of these events from Frank a bit, and I'll try to explain. At one level, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, in 1989 and onward, there was an intense desire to overcome the Soviet domination of the post-World War II period. And I was advising the Solidarity leadership from the first days of its legalization. And one night I was asked by Jacek Kuron, one of Lech Wałęsa's advisors, to write a plan for transformation and to have it ready in the morning. So it was an all-nighter that I will not forget. But Jacek Kuron said, you write the economics, but the first sentence has to be that this is about Poland returning to Europe. That was the spirit of the revolution, and that was the motivation of the reforms, and that was all of my ideas about making currencies convertible and opening to trade quickly and taking steps to align with what used to be called the acquis communautaire, to align with the laws of the European community and the European Union. And I think, broadly speaking, this has been a great success. There was another part of this story that is equally important, and that was Gorbachev's great vision. Mikhail Gorbachev is one of the most important people in modern history, one of the great statesmen of our time. Of course, he's often reviled at home and ignored in the West, but it was Mikhail Gorbachev that enabled a peaceful transformation, by and large peaceful, remarkably peaceful, because it could have ended in many kinds of disasters, many kinds of wars, including nuclear war. But Gorbachev believed in peace. He believed in democracy. He also believed in socialism, as we know, and he tried to make reforms of the Soviet Union and the Soviet system. But for me, the inspiring part of Gorbachev's vision was that he wanted a common home for Europe, and he often talked about a common home stretching from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. That was extremely inspiring for me, because I believe in global cooperation as being fundamentally important for our survival and well-being. And I went to work for one of Gorbachev's economic advisors, Grigory Yavlinsky, in 1990 and 1991 to try to help formulate a program of Western support for the Soviet Union, which was in intense financial disarray at the end of this long, fruitless period of state socialism and central planning. And in the spring of 1991, I worked on a plan which with Graham Allison and Stanley Fisher and others, which we called the Grand Bargain. And the idea was to help provide a financial base for Soviet Union's democratization. And we always had in mind the lessons of the harsh World War I settlement and Versailles and Keynes's warnings about not imposing harsh peaces. Well, all that work went to naught. The White House rejected it out of hand and never showed the slightest interest in giving any help to the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union dissolved, I was actually in the Kremlin the day that Boris Yeltsin cemented the agreement for ending the Soviet Union with the Soviet Army. In fact, he came out of that room and came to a meeting that I was participating in to announce that he had just concluded those negotiations. He asked me, and Yegor Gaidar asked me for help, again, along similar lines, to try to mobilize even rudiments of financial support in what was a very intense financial crisis. You know, the debt was short-term, intense, falling due, and depleting Russia's remaining few $billion of reserves. And so I recommended a debt standstill, which is very routine in an economic crisis, and the G7 rejected it again out of hand. There simply would be no help at all coming, and there wasn't any. And I found that really disappointing because in the comparable situation in Poland 2 years earlier, I had designed and negotiated a stabilization fund for the currency, an emergency loan, and deep debt relief, in fact, the cancellation of a significant part of Poland's debts. But when I made the same recommendations in the Soviet and then Russian context, it was a flat no from the West. Well, that didn't determine the course of events for the long term, but it sure did set a groove of instability and great unhappiness, I would say, even among reformers, of the lack of interest and support coming from the Western governments. I think it was a dreadful mistake. But the situation continued to spiral downward one step at a time. Even the first NATO enlargement was against directly what Genscher had assured Gorbachev with Baker's presence. And this is all very well documented, though completely disputed by the US, but so be it. The US does not tell the truth on most matters like this. But NATO expansion took place against the sounder judgments of people like William Perry, who was the defense secretary under Clinton and who thought about resigning in protest at the time. George Kennan, of course, famously said in 1998 that this was a disaster that would end up leading to a resurgence of a Cold War with Russia. I was there on many occasions. This was no small matter. This was a major matter. The extension of NATO to the Baltics was a further provocation because that was to Russia's border. But 2008 was really just as stupid as a stupid US administration could make it, and the George W. Bush administration did basically nothing right. But in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, it promised that NATO would expand to Ukraine and to Georgia. Well, by then, what I could say an economic reform and development point of view was that the broad process of economic convergence, which I expected to be the dominant way that Central and Eastern Europe would make up for lost time, was working. But it stopped at the border of the former Soviet Union, with the exception of the Baltic states, which have their own distinctive geography around the Nordic countries and their own history. But for the Slavic states and into Central Asia, there was little convergence at all. And the forces of convergence were weak, partly for normal geographic reasons, just farther from the center of gravity of the European economy, but also very much for political reasons. That the forces of magnetic pull to integrate with Europe worked where Europe was busy integrating. NATO certainly helped the countries that joined NATO, but created a new barrier on the other side in terms of diversion of trade and investment. So already by the 2000s, we had two worlds coming apart and a loss of confidence and a loss of trust that was deepening. The US bombing of Belgrade was another hugely consequential mistake, in my view, in 1999 that added to this the abandonment of the ABM treaty by the Bush administration, the invasion of Iraq, the color revolutions, so-called, which had a huge US push behind them. Then the actions of the US in the Middle East, trying to overthrow Assad in a CIA order issued by President Obama in 2012, Operation Timber Sycamore, the overthrow of the Libyan government by NATO in 2011, and then the US role in the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014, all meant that we were on a hugely divergent path. From then, the US has been putting in lots of weaponry, and we're seeing it at work in Ukraine. $3 billion recorded transfer during the Trump period. And when Putin repeatedly, not for the first time and not haphazardly and not as and not as an excuse, but for the 1,000th time since 1990, Russian leaders saying, "Why are you doing this? Stop," asked Biden to negotiate over the NATO expansion. The US flatly refused to put it on the table. The White House held all of the principles of the US government to account that we will not discuss NATO enlargement at all. It is the prerogative of Ukraine in the US interpretation, and it was not discussed. This is not an excuse. It's not contradictory to the hope for a revival of empire or glory. It is a battle over turf. And it's interesting that Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book, The Global Chessboard, in 1997 said that Ukraine is the geographic pivot of Eurasia. It is the place where the showdown will occur. And unfortunately, it is the place where the showdown is occurring. I have my doubts that Ukraine is going to defeat Russia. I continue to believe it's not even a term that makes sense when we're talking about an adversary with 1,600 active nuclear warheads and many thousand more that are in reserve. I don't know what defeat actually means, but I do believe that when Russia said today that nuclear war is becoming more likely, of course it's a vulgarity, but it's also not an empty statement. It is a real statement. When our Secretary of Defense says that our goal is to weaken Russia, when the State Department says it is to permanently isolate Russia, I think it's a mistake, and I think it's extraordinarily dangerous. As an economist, I think it's extraordinarily sad because actually global forces are good for the world if properly embedded with social policies. They do raise living standards. They enable the countries of Central Europe to have an accelerated catching up with the countries of Western Europe after this terrible period of Soviet domination. Russia could and would and should have benefited much more from cooperation had we been wiser and smarter about this over a 30-year period. But I don't believe in a world of alliances or camps. I don't much believe in NATO as a force for good in this world. That sounds very strange on a day like today when we're facing a Russian invasion. But I think that we have not used diplomacy properly for 30 years. So I don't want to be misunderstood, but I do want to say that there is something else beyond military alliances. There is diplomacy, there's decency, there is recognizing when you have a partner on the other side to do something to help after a tumultuous revolution. There is listening to the complaints of the other side and trying to accommodate rather than brazenly brushing them off as some kind of fulminant excuse of an absolute, I won't even know exactly what adjective, but every adjective is used. But what we don't do is have diplomacy. And so I very much regret this. I hope this war ends very quickly, not by a defeat, because I don't believe in that. I don't even believe it makes sense. But I do hope that it ends by a negotiation in which Ukraine becomes a neutral country, which is not a concession, in my view. It is prudence to the limit that the United States should not have a military alliance right up against 1,000 kilometers of Russian border. We should be prudent. We should be prudent also in Asia, and we should go back to Gorbachev's vision, a common home across Eurasia. I do not believe in this twilight struggle of democracies versus autocracies. I believe that we should try to get along and solve our problems that are common problems of ecological catastrophe, of growing inequalities, of a need to address a world filled with nuclear weapons in a way that doesn't get us all killed. So I hope the next 30 years of CERGE is going to be as successful as the past 30 years, and that it will be an era of cooperation that extends all the way to Vladivostok and to Beijing and to other countries that we somehow wrongly deem our enemies, and that we find a way to have a shared and cooperative vision. That's what got me started on this story more than 30 years ago, and I still believe in it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Not much. I think there is time if somebody would like to ask a question of each of the speakers. How do we do it? Is there a microphone? Yeah, so over there. And then, just so that you understand, we'll have the panel then later that will build up on this, and people will present their views in a discussion that will be open. So this is just the first foray into the debate. Yes, please.
Jeffrey, I'd like to address this question to you.
Maybe just identify yourself.
Certainly, my name is David Sutcliffe. So Jeffrey, the question is the U.S. trying to provoke a war with Russia, and is that related to late-stage capitalism?
Okay, and is there a question for Frank Fukuyama? Anybody would like to raise? I'm sorry, I don't see from here very well if there are hands or not. Okay, if not, I'll ask the question, but I certainly would like to give people a chance. All right. So Frank, I really like the way you've couched it back to sort of the superficial education, which indeed rings, very much true in some of the countries, at least in Central Eastern Europe. And I think that people there actually, who are part of NATO now, indeed think that the expansion of NATO was what they wanted, they voted for it and so on. And in some sense, you said, you're disputing the two fundamental, or there are, two fundamental views of the world order that are here. What of Jeff's points, which obviously have been documented in terms of having data behind that, would you be willing to incorporate into your view, and to what extent you actually are thinking that your view, which, as I say, many people in the region do share in Central Eastern Europe, should stand as you've stated it in your initial remarks?
Well, it's hard to object to the idea of diplomacy. I think that we did engage in diplomacy prior to the war. If you want to look at an unflinching diplomatic position, you should look at the Russian one at that time. I think that the NATO expansion argument it's correct up to a point. I was never in favor of the outcome at the Bucharest summit in 2008. I didn't think that Ukraine and Georgia should be offered NATO membership, or the promise of NATO membership. I would point out that, since that time, absolutely nothing happened, and there was no movement, to actually fulfilling that promise. But I was primarily opposed to it because I didn't think we could fill the Article 5 commitment to defend them, and it was really a matter of military logistics. But I think that probably the biggest difference I would have with Jeff is that he's too America-centric, that all of the decisions of the actors in that region revolved around some mistake that the United States made. NATO expansion was not pushed by the United States. It was pushed by, the Czech Republic and Poland and the Baltic states and all of the countries that had direct historical experience trying to live next to this Russian great power. And I think their understanding was that whatever the Russian leadership may behave or believe in the short run, the moment that the correlation of forces shifted in their favor, they would have a problem. And so I think if we hadn't expanded NATO, it wouldn't be Ukraine, it would be Poland and the Baltic states and other parts of Eastern Europe that would now be under direct Russian threat. But in general, it's hard to argue with the fact that, you can't simply demonize enemies, and that, diplomacy has always been part of a toolkit that, you need to deal with a power like either Russia or China.
Jeff, as you're answering the question, maybe it would be actually interesting to get your thoughts also on this idea. The fact was, as I was reading the situation in the polls, that really the people in the Central Eastern Europe, Baltics, really did want to join NATO, I think for the reasons that Frank is indicating. You're pointing out that there were, definitely sort of patterns in how US behaved and what it did at different points in time. But should the views of the people in the region have been taken or not taken into account in joining NATO?
Well, NATO is a US-led military alliance, and there are what we would say in economics externalities to our decisions. And therefore, it's not only the choice of a country, it is the external implications of that as well. Once upon a time, a country in the US neighborhood decided that it wanted to have a relationship with the Soviet Union because the US had invaded it. That was Cuba. Well, we almost went to nuclear war over this issue. The United States did not accept that. The United States did not accept having Castro even having friendly relations with the Soviet Union. We had the Bay of Pigs invasion. So it's incredibly, little bit hypocritical of the US, which invented the Monroe Doctrine 200 years ago, to say, no, doesn't matter what the implications are for anyone else. By the way, the US is in an absolute tizzy this week. We sent our senior NSC lead on Asia to Asia because the Solomon Islands, very small islands, 3,000 kilometers off the coast of Australia, signed a security pact with China. And this is taken to be calamitous for US interests. You look at US congressmen and congresswomen stating, this is unbelievable. How did this happen? And off went Kurt Campbell to try to make things right. This is the Solomon Islands, 3,000 kilometers away. Now we're talking about Ukraine on the border. Now it happens that in the case of Ukraine, George Bush pushed this over the strong opposition of European leaders. And that's how the Bucharest summit happened. It was disastrously wrong-headed then until now. The line that nothing much happened since then is absolutely a US ruse, because the US has been working on making this happen. And I would invite people to look at, I'm looking at a document called US Security Cooperation with Ukraine, fact sheet, March 3, 2022, about how we are increasing interoperability with NATO, how the US has contributed since 2014, committed more than $5.6 billion in assistance, security, non-security assistance, over $3 billion from the Defense Department in training and equipment to help Ukraine preserve territorial integrity, secure its borders, and improve interoperability with NATO. And then 2 security documents that we signed last year, one with the Defense Department and one with the State Department, both with the Ukrainian government, doubled down on NATO enlargement in the year that Putin was saying, let's negotiate. Now, the fact of the matter is, we did not negotiate 1 nanosecond on that issue. I know the story inside the administration. The decision was taken. We will have no negotiation whatsoever on the question of NATO enlargement to Ukraine. There was no negotiation in 2021 or 2022. Biden is a hardliner. He told us so, and he is, and that's the position. And I believe that we have played a very dangerous role, and we are continuing to play an extraordinarily dangerous game right now when we have our defense secretary openly saying our goal, it's not peace, it's not negotiation, because you haven't heard one word about negotiation, not a word that I know of. Maybe somebody can fill me in, but I have not heard Blinken say a word other than they're not going to go anywhere, negotiations. When Zelensky briefly said neutrality, you did not hear one word from the United States on the issue. And then that went off the table. And then Putin didn't say, I closed the door on negotiation. He said they reached a dead end because Ukraine stopped negotiating, which I'm not in the room, but I believe to be true because the US position is fight this out. We will defeat Putin. That is the US position, and it's been stated vividly in the last 2 days. Blinken said, Ukraine is winning, Russia is losing. Today, Lloyd Austin said in a NATO conference in Germany that many people think that Ukraine will win, and I know we do, and those in this room do. We're talking about winning the war. Frank did as well. God help us. I don't get it.
If I were fighting a country that is killing tens of thousands of innocent civilians, I would want to weaken their military, and I would want to win the war as well.
Yeah, and
We'll have to.
what it means to win. Because it might mean that we find, for the first time, a path to actually a discussion. You know, the Russians have been asking for US meetings with diplomats. We are not even meeting with Russian diplomats right now. What is that? Well, we're fighting a war, so we don't meet with diplomats. This is an administration dead set against negotiations. I don't get it. I'm not a military person. I do know something about nuclear weapons and their threat, and I'm terrified by this approach.
Okay, you guys, this has been obviously wonderful in the sense that we try to bring you together, not that you would agree, but that you would provide a discussion which has been fiery, has been inspirational, and thank you both very much for, say again, we have an extremely distinguished panel here, and it's wonderful that everybody has been able to make it. We'll start with Deidre McCloskey. Again, most of you need to get the introduction. She's Distinguished Professor of Economics, History, English, and Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Very well known for her 2019 Why Liberalism Works, How True Liberal Values Produce a Freer, More Equal, and Prosperous World for All. Massive economic, historical work, literary trilogy, The Bourgeois Era, 2006, 10, and 16. Indeed, a number of speeches, articles, contributions from all over. So it is wonderful to have you here, Deidre. If you would be willing to start with a 5-minute introductory set of remarks, we'll kick it off with you and move on to others.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I stutter, and very irritatingly, I stutter on my favorite word, which is liberalism. I'm often forced to use the Germanic word freedom, and I think the word freedom has drifted away from the correct way of thinking about liberty. See, I do. Which is the vision of a society absent slavery. Not the slavery of wives to husbands, not the slavery of parishioners to priests, not the slavery of slaves to masters, and not the slavery of citizens to the government. Now, this idea of liberalism is very new, historically speaking. It's only something over a couple of centuries old, and it was very much an ideal that was partially implemented. There's an ongoing struggle to extend it to gay people and to children and colonial people and so forth. So it's a slow progress. But I want to associate myself with Frank's view and not Jeff's. I like Jeff. I'm an economist, and I've known him in a small way for a long time. And he's an excellent economist, but maybe he's too much of an economist. There's the old joke when Castro came down from the mountains, having succeeded, he asked his group, we need someone who's an economist to be the Minister of Finance. And Shea put up his hand. Castro said, okay, you can be the Minister of Finance. And afterwards, in the joke, professor says to Che, look, I thought you were a doctor, not an economist. And Che said, economist? I thought you said communist. So it's not that I'm accusing Jeff of being a communist. I certainly am not. But I think the economic idea, which I hold like him close to my heart, that mutually beneficial exchange is a good thing. Sometimes, and this is the hour, has to give way to the principles of liberalism. It's just not right for us to deal with tyrants like Putin and Xi. I've been frustrated for so long that we keep saying, well, we can't do anything about China. Because we get so much stuff from China. You know, to hell with the stuff. To hell with the oil and gas. It's disgraceful the way the Germans are behaving in that way. Liberty matters. And then I say, and I say this as an economic historian in my books, I say, look, it turns out, it didn't have to be, it's not sort of a logical conclusion necessarily, it's not mathematical or something, but it turned out historically that societies that adopt liberalism, in which liberty is liberty is liberty, sexual, social, religious, economic, they're all the same. They're all not making people into slaves of each other. It turns out that results in astonishing innovation, such as the organizational innovation here. In a free society, one can do that. In a slave society, you can't. So I'm with Frank.
Thank you very much, Deidre. As you were talking about dealing with tyrants and buying their oil, etc., reminded me of the statement by Lenin saying that the capitalists will sell us the rope on which we'll hang them.
Yeah.
So one has to be careful. Now, I was wondering in which order we should get the speakers. I think it would be great if we get Bill Easterly next. I think that'll be a great way to dovetail. Bill, a renowned economist specializing in economic development, one of the foremost thinkers in this area, professor of economics at New York University, right here. He's also part of the Africa House, co-director of NYU's Development Research Institute, author of several books, including The Tyranny of Experts, Dictators, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor, White Man's Burden, which received a lot of attention, and the elusive quest for growth. So, Bill, take it from here. Thank you.
In 1990, I was a very junior World Bank economist going to Moscow on the first joint World Bank IMF mission to save the Soviet Union. One of my memories from that time is a conversation with another member of the mission who was a very distinguished Western Soviet specialist. And he asked me two questions. Did I speak Russian? No, I didn't. Had I ever worked on the Soviet Union? No, I didn't. He said, so why is the World Bank sending you to Moscow? I had to admit I didn't really have an answer to that question. That tells you something that you might need to know about the World Bank and IMF approach to Russia. So we were part of a fairly intensive effort over most of the rest of the 1990s. The succession of World Bank and IMF programs in Russia were designed to unleash a free market miracle in Russia after the end of communism? How well did this, and of course we're accompanied by a lot of distinguished Western economists, some of which you've heard from today, who were promoting doctrines like shock therapy, in which we thought we could have a very sudden transition from communism to capitalism, and sort of achieve instantly the wonders of a free market economy. How well did our programs and this Western approach to shock therapy and development assistance to Russia, how well did things work out? Well, let me give you two unlucky numbers, 65 and 5,000. In the first 8 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian per capita income declined to only 65%. That's the 65. Declined to 65% of its 1991 level by 1999. So in 1999, the per capita income of Russians was 65% of what it had been in 1991 before the fall of communism. And what about the number 5,000? 5,000 is the multiple by which the price level in 1999 was higher than the price level in 1991. There had been hyperinflation that increased the price level by a factor of 5,000 from 1991 to 1999. So it looked like shock therapy was all shock and no therapy. The free market miracle was neither a free market nor a miracle. So can we conclude about what was the effect of this intensive period of Western advised reform in Russia? Well, you can't take one episode and rigorously estimate what the counterfactual would have been without the blessings of Western economists coming and World Bank economists coming to Russia. We do know that the counterfactual would have had to have been worse than what actually happened. So to believe in a positive effect of this period of Western development assistance to Russia, you would need to believe that the price level would have been more than 5,000 times the price level in 91 without the intervention of Western development aid. And you need to believe that the economy would have contracted more than 35% without the intervention of Western development aid. So it's hard to rigorously resolve that question. I think a lot of citizens of Russia, as reflected in polls at the time, had a pretty clear answer themselves. This does not look like a great success of Western-based economic reform and Western development assistance. In fact, I think this is probably one of the worst periods of hubris of the whole world development assistance, Western development assistance business in all of post-war history. One of the greatest failures of Western development assistance in all of post-war history. So I decided at that point I had definitely failed as an expert on Russia. So I would try to become an expert on the other experts who had failed. That turned out to be a lot more satisfying endeavor than trying to save Russia. So in closing, let me just say that unlike my friend Jeff Sachs, I do not want to offer any excuses for Putin. Putin did not arise because of the failure that I'm talking about in the 1990s. I think what we see in Putin, if I'm allowed to give an amateur opinion, is the old horrible tradition that we've seen in so many parts of the world of simple tyranny. And if there's one good thing the West has to offer, it is our commitment to democratic ideals that is now broadly shared throughout Eastern Europe, and I'm very proud of that part. Thank you very much.
I suggest we now move to Angus Daeton, then to Branko Milanovič, and have Paul Krugman as the final speaker. Now, Angus Daeton, again, doesn't have to be introduced to too many people. Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, is the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs at Princeton University, has done a lot of research in many areas. Most recently, his focus on poverty, inequality, health, and economic development has been very much on the forefront, but he's done pioneering work in applied econometrics, microeconomics, etc. Those of us who studied earlier remember that work as well. He and Case have been named by Prospect Magazine's 2019 list of world's top 50 thinkers. So this was based on the work on US mortality data. Angus served on the executive and supervisory committee of CERGE-EI, has been to Prague many times, and indeed has contributed valiantly in a major way to the success of CERGE-EI that we have witnessed over the last 30 years. Angus, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you very much, Jan. I'm probably the least qualified person on this platform to talk about this, but I'm going to try. And I do want to say how proud I am of the time I did spend helping Serge. I remember enough of that to know that it was not easy. Some of those meetings were some of the worst meetings I've ever attended in my life. But, you know, we battled our way through these and came to some very good decisions, I think. More generally, thinking back 30 years to the fall of the wall and beyond, I remember just how hopeful we were, but also, in retrospect, how naive we were. One of the things that I've been thinking recently is that Eastern Europe in some ways was unfortunate in its timing, in that the collapse of the Soviet Union coincided with the height of Western unqualified enthusiasm for free markets and their power to solve almost everything. 30 years later, or 30 years earlier, I think we would have been more qualified and perhaps more careful. Perhaps in the long run, markets do bring robust prosperity and democracy, but it's not been tremendously, it's been somewhat disappointing so far. More broadly, and I have written this elsewhere, it's possible to see the last 250 years as an era of unparalleled progress. There have been really bad times before, many of the worst in the 20th century, but we always came out ahead of it. And, you know, the horrors of many of the great horrors of the 20th century, you know, we always came out better in the end. And I'm still hopeful that we will face the challenges we face today, and for the same reasons, but I'm perhaps not quite so sure as I used to be. Markets were what we thought would solve much of this, and a part of market expansion, I'm including globalization of sort of international markets. And they have indeed brought unparalleled prosperity, material prosperity, to billions of people. But material prosperity is not the only thing that people care about. Rapid growth brings destruction and change, and the process can undermine the long-standing social, environmental, and economic systems on which people depend. Material growth is particularly dangerous when it's not shared, when some get the growth and others get the destruction. It is remarkable, looking back over this 30 years, how similar the stories are in the East and West. So I don't think about this as a story of the East. I think of it as a story of both East and West. In the US, the last 30 years have seen the consequences of 50 years of job destruction and falling wages for the 2/3 of the population without a 4-year college degree. Despite, hard time. I should have made this bigger time. Too old for this. Despite the falling wages for the 2/3 of the population without a 4-year college degree, what Ann Case and I call deaths of despair have been rising since the mid-1990s over the same period. And since 2010, life expectancy has steadily fallen in the US for those without a 4-year college degree, while continuing to rise for those with a college degree. The only other place in history where we've seen this happen is in Eastern Europe around the fall of the Soviet Union. I'll come back to life expectancy. So less educated Americans today are experiencing something of the catastrophe, the health catastrophe that was seen in the East after 1990. In the East, some have seen previously unimaginable good fortune, with many moving to distinguished careers away from their home countries. Kristalina Georgieva is far from the only Bulgarian working at the IMF. Many are now our university colleagues, and a few are fabulously rich. But as Branko will note, many others did not benefit from this globalization, just as the less educated in the US did not benefit from it. Eastern countries also suffered, the population left behind also suffered from something Frank talked about and is not widely commented on, which is the enormous loss of their populations as people moved away from the area to live in the West, and especially their most talented countrymen and countrywomen, which made it governance hard, education hard, and politics particularly hard. I like to think about life expectancy as some sort of marker for what is going on, probably more sensitive in many ways than GDP. There are 10 countries in the OECD, 11 if you count my native Scotland, which of course they don't count as a country, where deaths of despair, that's suicides, drug overdoses, and alcoholic liver diseases per million are higher than in the US. 5 of those are in the East: Slovenia, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary, and Poland, where alcohol and suicide rather than drug overdoses are the main killers. The mental health effects of social destruction and dislocation are not something we took very seriously into account when thinking about bringing markets to the East when we thought about shock therapy. The picture is not uniformly bleak. The catastrophic decreases in life expectancy in the East after 1990 have now reversed, at least up until COVID, with rapid increases in life expectancy to 2005, even in Russia itself. And I'm very ambivalent about saying this, but the life expectancy in the Czech Republic just before COVID is actually higher than it is in my native country of Scotland. So those terrible reverses in the 1990s have been made up. Of course, we're going to spend a lot of the next 10 or 15 years trying to figure out who suffered worse from COVID and why. But Russia seems to have had one of the largest COVID-related reductions in life expectancy. Peru, from 2019 to 2021, life expectancy fell by 4.5 years in Russia, according to the latest numbers. There are only 2 other countries, and 4.1 in Bulgaria and 4.1 in North Macedonia, which are the largest falls in the world, except for Peru and Guatemala. The US, which many people regard as having a pretty catastrophic response, lost 2 years of life expectancy too. So if you look at this from a health or life expectancy perspective, the scorecard is really not very good, even though for much of the East, even in Russia, things were getting better, at least until COVID. But COVID was very bad indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. I should mention, just you reminded me of a part, we indeed had quite a few difficult meetings. Some of them were not just amongst us, although we achieved quite a lot of hardship there as well. But remember we walked into the rector's office at Charles University once because we were stuck and really needed Charles University to do something for us. And Angus walked in there and in his majestic style said, "Mr. Rector, either you do this or we're leaving." And the rector did it. So here is a man of action. All right, Branko. That's right. So Branko Milanovič, an old friend, Serbian-American economist, known for a lot of his work, but most people know him for his work on income distribution and inequality. He is currently the visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's affiliated with the Luxembourg Income Study, one of the most most famous studies, has written important books, The Haves and Have-Nots in 2011, was selected by the Globalists as the 2011 Book of the Year. Global Inequality in 2016 was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Prize for the Best Political Book of 2016 and the Hans Matthofer Prize in 2018, translated into 16 plus languages. He was also in 2010 awarded the Leontiev Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic knowledge, and his new book, Capitalism Alone, was published in September 2019.
2 months ago. But now let me, I took Jan's recommendation to look at good and bad things that have happened during these 30 years, as you have actually already heard from all the participants, so I will just add to that. And I have to say that after hearing Jeff and Frank, since everybody seems to be a little bit sort of on the memory lane, I have to say that I knew Jeff from 1987, actually, at his first trip to Warsaw in Poland. That was still under the old government. And I also have to say that, in my opinion, Jeff really contributed hugely to Polish stabilization, and as he mentioned, to the fact that Poland got a very significant, I think 66% reduction in debt. So I think Jeff's contribution in the case of Poland was absolutely of first rate. Now, let me go over the sort of dark and bright parts of the last 30 years. Okay, first, I would like to think of the first cleavage, which I think is an important one, between ethnic federations of USSR and Yugoslavia. Why? Because we talk today about wars and conflicts. And if you look at that, there were 12 wars and conflicts of some significance after 1989. Now, all of them happened in these two ethnic federations of the past. None of them happened outside. And now 11 out of these 12 happened about borders. There is only one, which was Tajikistan, where there was not an issue of borders. All the others were old-fashioned nationalist conflicts, which can go back in Eastern Europe at least 2 centuries to after Napoleonic Wars, but they were conflicts about borders. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind, because I think very often we tend to overemphasize the ideology of, democracy versus autocracy and things like that. In reality, the fights are about borders. So that's the first point on sort of a dark side. Now, let's move to the more pleasant things. And I think actually there is the success there of the Eastern enlargement of the European Union. And when you look at the countries there are 11 countries that have become members of the European Union, as you know, at different enlargement episodes. The first there were 8, then 2 more, and then finally Croatia, the 11th. Actually, their growth rates, if you compare them to the other members, have been significantly higher. If I start with 2004, obviously the numbers are, I start with 2004 because it was the first enlargement, but the growth rate of Eastern European countries on average population-weighted GDP was 2.5%, whereas that was the after COVID, so it's year 2000. And Western Europe over the same period had actually, the other countries rather, had only a growth rate of practically 0. It's not, of course, very much realized, I think, that, for example, countries like Italy, even before COVID, had 20 years of 0 growth. We are talking about one generation of Italians have actually had no growth. So Eastern Europe did actually converge, and even if, since I work with, household surveys and income data, you see the same thing in income data. That actually, the rate of growth was, this is now in international dollars, but not of the same year. So the rate of growth was 5.5%. For Western Europe, it was 3%. So this was certainly a significant success case. Now, if you compare East European countries that have become members to the East European countries that have not become members, there the situation is kind of difficult to interpret because the non-members are very heterogeneous. The members have become actually more homogeneous in terms of their mean income, and their overall inequality, if you take these 11 countries, has not actually increased. When you compare them with the non-members transition countries, Russia dominates by population, by size. So essentially you're then comparing what happened to the 11 members to practically Russia and Ukraine, which are of course the largest non-members. So this is I think the success case, and of course I'm very much in favor of European or intra-European integration. I think it's a little bit unfortunate, if I have to say that the current crisis has not been used by the European Union, with the exception of Ukraine, has not been used to actually accelerate that movement. You know, there is lots of skepticism about the European Union, but the non-members, despite being skeptical, if they were given a chance to vote whether they would become members or not, would vote for it. So now let me move to the third point, which is actually goes back to my work on global income inequality, and which is an ambivalent point. And I'm sorry we don't have these graphs, but they're actually very nice. So I would suggest that people look them on my Twitter feed. And the graphs are the following. What has happened?
Here they are. Here they are.
Oh, they are. Yeah. Okay, so you see, this is great, actually. So the first one is the positions of people along the income distribution. Let's start with China, because that's actually would give you the idea what I want to say. You take Chinese income distribution 1988, take each decile of that distribution, and find their position in the global income distribution. Obviously, Chinese who are very poor, the bottom decile of China, would be also very poor globally. So I don't remember the number, but you see the first decile in China was at the 15 or 12th percentile in the world. Now, China has, of course, gone forward. So every decile has improved its position globally. So that's why you have this shift. That shift doesn't show you only the improvement in real incomes. The shift shows you the shift shows you the improvement in the relative position. Now, the improvement in the relative position of China means that somebody else has to actually go down. I mean, this is obvious. You have, if somebody goes up in an ordinal ranking, somebody has to go down. Now, look at the next graph, which is Italy, and I'll tell you why Italy is very interesting for Eastern Europe. What you notice in the case of Italy, the red line is the blue line, like in the case of China, is the beginning period. It was, I think, 1988 for Italy, and the red line is 2018. What do you notice? The lower part of the Italian income distribution has declined. And this is the feature, actually, Angus mentioned before, the stagnation of wages, the stagnation of incomes in the lower parts of the Western distributions. And then you see for Italian upper middle class, they have improved a little bit, and the very top has remained the same. But notice that decline in the lower part of the income distribution. So let's now move to Eastern Europe. And that's why you would see the next pictures, are ambivalent. Now, you take Poland, which is probably the biggest success case in Eastern Europe. There could be a few others, but I think Poland, because of its size and because it's an extraordinary rate of growth, is considered rightly as a success case. Now, what you notice in Poland is a very similar picture like in Italy. Despite Polish very high growth, even among the poorest Poles and in the lower part of the income distribution. And why? And we go back to the picture of China. Because what is happening when you have this ordinal stuff is that countries that have populations that are sort of close to the lower part of the income distribution of East European countries are growing faster. Actually, Asia is growing faster. So despite the fact that Poland has been doing very well and was converging to West European standards, it was losing out in the lower part of the income distribution globally because the competitors there were Asian countries that grew even faster than Poland. And then when you move to Croatia, and of course I did the same graph when I did this presentation in Zagreb, I did it also for Belgrade. The picture is the same, except Serbia is worse because everybody has deteriorated. And actually, when you look at Croatia, which is maybe, you can say, an average, neither a success case nor a failure, you have the deterioration of the position of practically the entire distribution except at the top. Why is this the case? Because now we are not measuring East European success versus Western Europe, which had a fairly sort of mediocre period, but we are measuring it against the world. And we do it against the world, then we actually have the importance of Asia and importance of populous countries like China, Vietnam, India, Thailand, Indonesia, and so forth. So this is the, how should I say, I think actually I had in this presentation one dark picture, one bright, and one sort of, you know, glass half full, half empty. And I think that basically, in my opinion, does actually summarize the 30 years of transition. Thank you very much.
Our last but not least speaker is Paul Krugman, whom many of you know because he's been a very famous columnist for the New York Times and of course elsewhere. He has taught at a number of universities, Princeton, London School of Economics, New York, City of University of New York Graduate Center, and indeed the Washington Monthly has called him the most important political columnist in America. And the Asia Times recently called him the Mick Jagger of political/economic punditry. Now, if that doesn't compete with the Nobel Prize, what does, right? So, now before I went to Columbia, I was at the University of Michigan, where there is a Nestor of the economics profession in international trade named Alan Deardorff. And Alan Deardorff keeps tab of all economists who work on international trade. So he has it all perfectly tabulated. So he was saying that, in his view, Paul Krugman is one of the most recognized and best international trade economists. So in case, Paul, you haven't heard it, here it is. So if you could spend 5 minutes giving your point of view, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Okay, so unlike I think most of this panel, I have never worked on transition economies, never worked on Eastern Europe. But when the wall came down, it was kind of, there was a kind of a scramble, if I might say, within the economics profession to get involved. It was sort of, to be a little cynical, you know, having an Eastern European country that you were advising became a crucial fashion accessory in the profession. And I chose not to even try to get into that game, which I have to say looks like one of the best life decisions I've ever made. So I have not worked on that region at all, and I thought that what I should do is actually talk about what's happened in the world, rather than specifically in the former Soviet Empire since the fall of the wall. And I think there are, in terms of what's gone right, well, what's gone right and what's gone wrong. The first thing to say is that if we just step back a bit, these past 30 years have been the most extraordinary era of economic progress ever. From a sort of human point of view, from a ruthless cosmopolitan point of view. If you ask how much has the median human being gained from economic progress, there's been nothing like these past 3 decades. So Branko's most famous picture still is the elephant graph, which does show us, you know, a handful of people at the top 1% of the world doing extremely well, but much more importantly, a huge number of people in the middle of the world income distribution doing well. And it's not just, we obviously think of China, which is the tremendously, you know, the overwhelming case, but also India, and also countries, I often find that people who are, you know, looking at these things aren't aware of the transformation that's taken place in some countries that are still very poor, but are bigger than you think and have made more progress than you think. So Bangladesh does not look, you know, is not often touted as a role model, and yet that was a country that was, you know, literally on the edge of famine, has had famines almost within living memory, and has had enormous economic progress. So that huge progress is, you know, is an overwhelming fact. The somewhat disappointing piece of that economic story is that if you ask, so what does it take to achieve one of these success stories? The answer is that we are still remarkably clueless about it. So Bill is talking about the World Bank. The early 90s were the era when the World Bank took the lead, but it was widely believed that we had the formula. You know, liberalize, privatize, shift from an inward-looking to an outward-looking trade regime, and your per capita income growth will accelerate by 2 percentage points. We thought there was a very simple formula. And it has turned out that that's not at all true. Sometimes the magic works and sometimes it doesn't. That there are, if I were thinking, not being at all an Eastern European type, what I think about a lot is the disappointments of Latin America, where major changes in trade policy, large scale, attempts to undo some of the constraints of over-regulation, privatize, and efficient sectors never did yield the kind of growth. The big question of, even though they often created economic transformation, it didn't generate the kind of growth they were looking for. I would say that the 1993 is the year of NAFTA, and the fact that Mexico has not converged in per capita income on the United States it has not been terrible. It's nothing like the disasters that occurred in Eastern Europe, but the fact that all of the things that were supposed to really jumpstart economic progress didn't seem to do it, is a reproach to our understanding of the world. The other thing that has gone wrong, and again, we've had this, taking the broad picture, enormous economic progress much around the world. A lot of people thought that this would necessarily lead to progress in other dimensions. So as it happens, among the places where I taught I spent 2 years at Stanford in the mid-1990s. I was a trailing spouse, basically. And multiple meetings at the Hoover Institution, in which, if I had to say what I heard from people was, call it vulgar modernization theory. I'm aware if there are any actual political scientists in here, you know that that's a much subtler field. But what I heard was basically the story: economic growth produces a large middle class. A large middle class demands representative government and rule of law, and therefore we can pretty much count on the world becoming more and more like Western Europe and the United States. That hasn't happened. In fact, what is really, really disappointing is that you can have countries that have achieved enormous material progress, like China or India, and if anything, they seem to be backsliding in terms of rule of law and democratic norms. But then again, countries that have been wealthy for a long time have these problems too. And the most frightening thing in the world right now is what's happening right here. The dangers of political backsliding are far greater I think in the United States than perhaps anywhere else. And all of it is showing that there are no guarantees. Whatever it is, that material progress is not enough. Obviously, I have absolutely no expertise or anything, but the fact of the matter about the thing that we're all, I'm trying to limit my news obsessive news. I'm trying to limit my reading of Ukraine war news to about 13 hours a day. This is, among other things, it is whether Eastern European, whatever anybody else likes, this is at some level it's a proxy fight between that it involves values that are very much contested here. If you want to think about how all of this relates to more immediate concerns, think about the fact that CPAC, assume that people do know, CPAC, the heart of the right-wing anti-democratic movement here, is holding its next meeting next month in Budapest. Right? So I'm sorry, I can't take that kind of distant view that says, well, we should we don't want winners and losers. I want to see the anti-democratic forces get a bloody nose. But in any case, the fundamental points are don't minimize, for all of the bad things that have happened economically in some places, don't minimize the fact that this has been an amazing period of economic progress for the human race. But don't lose sight of the fact that the political progress that we were promised has turned out to be absolutely not a sure thing.
Thank you very much. We've had definitely quite a lot of wonderful food for thought. So the microphones are ready for those who would like to ask questions. I see a hand over there and over there. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit under the light.
Thank you very much to panelists. My name is George Wachadze. I'm a proud graduate of CERGE-EI 1999 I graduated, so more than 2 decades. So I have 2 questions which basically draws on the points made by the keynote speakers about neutrality. You know, this is, I think, I'm Georgian and I studied the history of Soviet republics, and neutrality was tried in 1918. For example, Georgia was independent and neutral country that time, but Russia invaded. This is the country which systematically violates all agreements. And one thing which I think is worthwhile to mention here is 1994 agreement about the nuclear arms which Ukraine gave to Russia. And Russia admitted sovereignty of Ukraine and violated this, greatly violated, okay? So my question to panelists, do you think is neutrality sensible now for Ukraine to seek? And that's one part of my question. And I have a second one. And the second point was US is not doing, enough to negotiate, and speaker brought the point that Gorbachev was admiring, but we need to remember what put Gorbachev in power. It was extreme weakness of the Soviet Union. I was a kid and I was witnessing all the events of armament of United States, and that brought to the knees the Soviet Union, and that created an internal destruction. If we continue and the US continues weak, dialogue with Russia, it basically emboldens the dictators. And someone who watched the Bucha, what happened to Bucha, there is no point to negotiate with this bloody regime. Thank you. So my second point is there anything which United States can negotiate with Russia? That's my second question to panelists. Thank you very much.
Okay, I suggest we collect a few questions and then we let the panelists respond. I think we had a hand over there, Yasmin.
Well, mine's very simple to economists, and
Okay,
that
identify yourself just so we get to know each other.
I'm sorry, I'm Karen Chapman. I'm in entertainment, so this is not my field. So
I don't think your microphone is on.
Well, this is not my area. I appreciate the economists. So the question very simply is, what is Russian GDP? How does their economy compare to China, to the United States since 1999, but particularly in the last 5 or 10 years? Just what is their power?
Okay, thank you. Are there more hands over there? Yep.
Good afternoon. My name is Milanovič. Thank you very much for this event. I am very honored to be with such professional people. I'd like to ask please a question. How do you think the world's order will look like in 10 years? And how will G7 look like and G3? Thank you.
All right. Any more? Here, right here.
Thank you. It's Carolyn Wilkins from the Griswold Center for Economic Policy at Princeton. I have a lot of economists here, so I can't help but ask about where you think globalization will go. There are some that say, trade's trade, and we've got these linkages, and we might see some pullback, but not much. And then there's others that say, no, we're going to end up with a retreat from globalization and more regionalization and fragmentation in relationships, whether they're financial through payments or whether they're through supply chains. And so I'm just wondering if you had to see where we'd be in 10 years, is it more the same, or do you think we'll be living in a bifurcated world?
All right. Any more questions? If not, I'll ask the last question and then we'll let, oh, there is one, okay.
Thank you. I am Ojiva. I'm a doctoral student at Columbia, working on my dissertation, Gendered Inequities of Health and Empowerment. My first question is, so my motivation for the dissertation is what we saw in mass movement of people in Syria, and now we see in Ukraine. What are your thoughts on some discriminatory policies on refugees and immigrants? And my second part of the question is, as you or the expert, we look up to you, we read your work, and this question is motivated from the fact that your work, you've written on inequality, poverty, climate change, you've seen the world change. What kind of work do you see from emerging scholars and economists? Thank you.
All right, I will ask one question, then we'll turn to the panel and have them answer. A lot of interesting thought, and I think one that appears here that's really fascinating to me as well is we're talking about the distribution of income among across the quantiles, about deciles of population and different countries, etc. There is also a question of the distribution among labor and capital, the functional distribution. And that, as far as I can tell, in a number of countries has shifted over the decades in favor of capital. So a larger part of GDP or value added is going to capital as opposed to labor. How much of that is actually accounting for some of the phenomena that you've been discussing, and what is the implication of that for economic success of countries and so on?
Point, I think you'll find that the share change is small. I mean, for instance, in the United States, when it moved towards capital, it was a matter of 3 or 4% of national income, and now that's starting to come back, and that would be my point about my answer to the questions here, is that the prospects are bright for the world. And I have to urge you, it's my professional responsibility as an economic historian to urge you to take the long view. Over the last 2 centuries, since the invention, so to speak, of free economic societies, income has increased in lots of countries by 3,000% per capita. And in the world as a whole, including countries that haven't gone down the free route, it's still 1,000%, utterly unprecedented. And for all the talk about environmental problems and inequality and woe is me, I think the future is bright. I'm glad you agree, and I have an investment opportunity for you.
Yeah, let me just, I actually want to respond mainly to, there were 2 economics questions, and then just, let me respond to those first. First was about the Russian economy. And you really need to understand that Russia is very much a second-rate economic power, if that. I mean, it's an economy that's an order of magnitude smaller than that of China or the US or the European Union. It's a pretty small player in sheer terms. Now, we thought of it as being a much more significant player in terms of military power, which is turning out to be not quite so true as apparently the Russians themselves thought. It does have nukes, which is it's not really an indefinable factor. But no, Russia, I mean, one of the things that this is a country that has been was trying to punch way above its economic weight, and is not succeeding. Actually, just to give you, I mean, like I said, I'm kind of obsessively following this, but the current estimates, how logistics production, Russia appears to have lost 2 years of tank production in the war in Ukraine so far. That gives you an idea of the actual size of the economic base that lies behind what they're trying to do. It's really very small. The globalization, I think there's so many imponderables about political reactions and so on. Globalization actually kind of stalled out about 15 years ago. We really haven't seen large increases in the share of trade in world GDP since the eve of the financial crisis. We saw a little bit of trade war and so on, and now it's all really disrupted. The one thing I would say that has turned out to be a surprise to me, and I'm still not quite managing to process it, is that the kind of globalization that is taking the hardest hit is not the fancy stuff. We talked a lot about these global supply chains and the fact that the phone in my pocket is produced in about 15 different countries. But where the real disruptions are right now is in wheat, fertilizer, oil, metals. It's the kind of globalization that we've had for 150 years. That's the kind of stuff that's being really disrupted. I'm not quite sure what to make of that, whether that is going to lead to a lot more sort of inward retreat, or is that just telling me something odd. Let me just say about the neutrality. People call it, neutrality is one of those words that sounds very good, but depends on exactly who you're supposed to be neutral towards. It's a little bit like bipartisanship. Bipartisanship sounds like a great thing unless you're actually trying to deal with Donald Trump. So,
all right.
Bill?
So I want to join the pessimism versus optimism debate, which has really been good here. I think if you thought the world depended on these sort of bumbling Western experts trying to save the world, then you would be very pessimistic. Fortunately, the world does not depend on them. I agree very much with Deidre and Paul that actually there have been an enormous number of positive economic trends over the last 30 years. The world extreme poverty rate has fallen from 30% to 10%, less than 10% over that time. And reasonable projections would see it going pretty close to zero in the next 10 or 20 years. So there's been an awful lot of positive stuff happening, but mainly through the efforts of people themselves, developing themselves, not depending on us bumbling experts trying to save them, trying to fix them. So in the end, you can be very pessimistic about the bumbling experts, but very optimistic about people saving themselves, as they're doing a very good job of doing it.
Let me say a little bit about the hopefulness. I mean, I wish I could totally agree with Deidre, because I find the arguments incredibly attractive and appealing. And I believe in liberalism too, in the sense of freedom and what you talked about. What I worry about is liberalism destroying itself from within. And I think there's a real possibility of that. And Deidre doesn't like to talk about income distribution or people dying, provided our incomes are higher than they were in 1800. But I'm not sure you can really do that. And I talked in my remarks about, the 2/3 of the American population who's less educated, who've gotten basically nothing for 50 years, and whose life expectancy has been falling sharply for 10 years, and where overall life expectancy in the US has been falling for several years before COVID and very rapidly during COVID. And, I'm not sure you can do that sustainably. And in Britain, you've got very much the same sort of thing. There's people who are seen as a globalized elite who are benefiting from globalization and all the growth that's going on, and a large number of people who want none of it. We've seen a situation in France in which you can heave a huge sigh of relief that Macron was re-elected, but it wasn't such a, it wasn't such a huge margin. And, India, where I spent a lot of my life, has become a sort of performative state where the people in charge are just creating hatred, whipping up communal hatred that's centuries old, and not delivering anything to people at the same time. And you're seeing this all over the world. And, we could see that as a, if this goes the wrong way, we get Donald Trump would only be the beginning of this. As far as the experts are concerned, don't forget about the vaccines. One of the most stunning things about the 1919 pandemic was that it was swept under the carpet and it was sort of written out of history. I'm beginning to see the same things happening with COVID here. It's not just that it's finished, it's just that it sort of never happened. And what happened during COVID was, we went back 10, 20 years. And not only that, we went back into something that we thought was in the dustbin of history, which is a giant pandemic that would kill, 1 million people in the United States and tens of millions of people around the world. We thought that could never happen again. We thought we were on top of this. And I was one among many others who really believed that pandemics like that could not come back again, that the scares about 1919 coming back again were completely premature. And we still don't know how it happened, why it happened, and we don't know that it won't happen again. But if that happens on a regular basis, then I don't think our institutions can really withstand that for very long. So like Deidre, the past 200 years has been great. I wrote a book called The Great Escape, in which the guiding metaphor was the movie in which people escaped, from a German prison war camp. And, everybody escaped and life got better and life expectancy got better and it was fantastic. But you have to remember at the end of that movie, most of those people died. They were recaptured and shot by the Nazis. And, it may be 2,000 years from now, we'll look back and say, boy, we had this great 200 years from 1800 to about 2000, and then it all went to shit after that, right? Don't write that future off. It's really possible. And this may have just been a flash in the pan, not the beginning of something that's going to go on forever and ever and ever. I wish it were.
Very briefly on 2 points. First, on Deidre's point, I actually, of course, agree. I was involved. I'm still involved with medicine, project in Groningen. So obviously, we deal with these numbers, and all the numbers that you quoted are accurate. The problem is, what is the comparator? If you went to Eastern Europe in 1989 and told them that everybody is better off than in 1945, that really would not really gain you much sympathy nor approval, because the comparator was Western Europe. And actually it is very clear if you compare, for example, there were studies on Hungary versus Austria. And up to 1960-65, the difference was small and actually historically the same as it was before. And then things changed. And by 1990, the difference was sizable. The same, you take Romania and Greece, for example. Also similar empirical studies, similar results. So really the comparator, and going back to Angus's point, the comparator is very important. People look at other people around them, not necessarily at what, for example, their parents lived or grandparents. Now the second point on Russia, of course I was very interested in historical reasons in Russia's economy. This, as Bill said originally, I mean, it was huge decline, and of course there was then recovery, which started basically, Putin was lucky to some extent, that started at the same time that he became president in 2000, and then continued, but then there was, the last 10 years were basically stagnation, a few years with positive growth, and a few years with negative growth, and then COVID came, and as Angus said, actually COVID had an extremely sort of profound impact on life expectancy and the number of people who died. But it's, to give sort of another example, it's almost 1/10 of the Chinese economy. and it's about 1/8 on the US economy in terms of purchasing power, and it would decline because, and that's I think an interesting issue. Then again, I'm quoting everybody, including Paul, what he said about the tank production. Actually, I've been reading Russian papers that basically say 95% of softwares used in Russian companies are Western softwares. There will be no updates for these softwares. You might have read probably that Russia would remain without civil aviation within 3 or 4 years, because it cannot get parts for the Western planes that it actually depends on, and it's no longer producing. But the Soviet Union and Russia was a producer of airplanes, but that production no longer exists. The same situation is with cars. The cars are put together by Renault, Mazda, Toyota, and others. Russian companies actually, well, they still have them, but they are also depend on parts. So the extent of the decline, I think, in the next few years would be quite severe.
All right, the witching hour has arrived. We're about 15 minutes late, which is for academics pretty good. That's not bad. But nevertheless, you're all welcome to join us for reception. The bar is behind us, but let's first thank the speakers for